For 3 nights the whole town heard it. A thin, high, breaking sound drifting down out of the pines, the kind of sound that crawls in through the cracks in the shutters and sits on your chest while you pretend to sleep. Some said it was a coyote. Some said it was the wind bending through the dead timber up on the ridge. And a few, the ones who wouldn't meet your eye when they said it, swore it was a trick. Bait. A crying child left out in the cold to draw a fool up the mountain so the dark could close behind him. So nobody went. Doors got barred a little tighter. Prayers got said a little longer. And the sound kept coming, night after night, until the whole valley learned to fold it into the silence and go on with their supper. Everyone ignored the crying in the forest. Everyone but one man. And this is the part nobody in that town likes told, even now, even after all these years. Because when he finally climbed up into those trees to see what was really making that sound, what he found up there didn't just break his heart. It broke the town's story about itself. Stay with me, this one doesn't go the way you think. I keep a logbook, have for 30 years. Weather calving, the price of feed, which fence post rotted through, and which coyote got into which pen. My wife used to laugh at me for it, said a man who wrote down the weather every morning was a man afraid the day might get away from him without permission. Maybe she was right. She was right about most things, and then she was gone, and after that the logbook was about the only voice left in the house that answered back. So when I tell you the crying started on a Tuesday, it's because I wrote it down. Twos, cold front moving, heard restless, heard something up on Blackwood Ridge after dark, could be a cat. Could be a cat. That's what I told myself that first night, the way you tell yourself a thing you don't believe just to have somewhere to set it down. It didn't sound like a cat. I've heard mountain lions scream, and it'll stand every hair on your body up straight, but a cat sounds like a cat, there's a wildness in it. A thing that doesn't want anything from you but your fear. This was different. This had want in it. This rose and fell and caught, rose and fell and caught, and every time it caught, some old buried part of me flinched like I'd been touched. I lay there in the dark of a house too big for one man, and I listened to it, and I did nothing. That's the first thing I have to tell you before I tell you anything else, that I did nothing. 2 whole nights I did nothing. By Thursday the town was talking. You have to understand what a town like ours was in those days. We were 40 families scratched into a valley the railroad hadn't found yet. 3 days' hard ride from anywhere that mattered, hemmed in on the north by the Blackwood pines and on every other side by country that would kill you slow if you let it. We had a church, a store, a smith, a lawman named Del Prout who was mostly for show, and a great deal of fear we didn't like to call by its name. That fear had a shape. It had a name we said in low voices, Apache. I won't dress it up for you. There'd been trouble in the territory going back further than any of us. There'd been blood on both sides and lies about the blood on both sides, and the lies had grown into a thing bigger than the truth ever was. By the time I'm telling you about, most of us had never so much as spoken to an Apache man in our lives. Didn't matter. We'd inherited the fear the way you inherit a bad knee. It was just in us, and it ached when the weather turned. So when the crying kept up and kept up, you can guess which way the talk went. I heard it at the store, Friday, buying coffee. I didn't need just to have a reason to be around people. Old Harlan Voss was holding court by the stove, and Harlan had a theory the way a dog has a bone. It's a lure, he said, old trick. They put a young'un out where a man can hear it, and that man's got a soft heart, so up he goes. And the last thing that soft-hearted fool ever sees is the trees closing up behind him. He looked around the room, satisfied. You mark me. Anybody goes up Blackwood after that sound, we're digging a hole for him come spring. A couple of men nodded. Nobody argued. I didn't argue either. I stood there with my coffee I didn't need, and I thought about the sound catching in the dark, that little hitch in it, and I didn't say a word. Because here's the ugly truth of it, and I've had a lot of years to look at it plain. It wasn't that I believed Harlan. I didn't, not really. It was that believing Harlan let me stay home. His fear did a favor for my cowardice, and I took the favor, and I told myself it was sense. That night the crying came again, thinner than before, weaker, like whatever was making it was running down. I wrote in the logbook, "Fry, cold, sound again from the ridge, fainter." And then I sat with my pen over the page a long time, because there was one more thing I wanted to write and couldn't. What I wanted to write was, "It sounds like a child." I couldn't put it down, because if I put it down, it was real. And if it was real, then every hour I sat warm in my house was an hour I was choosing. I blew out the lamp instead. I need to tell you about Sarah now, or none of the rest will land right. Sarah was my wife. We had 11 years, which isn't nothing, but it isn't enough either. It's just enough to learn a person all the way through and start to believe you get to keep them. We tried a long time for a child, buried two before they drew breath. The third came in the dead of a winter as hard as this one, and for one night, one whole night, we had a daughter. She cried that night, strong, furious, alive. The most beautiful sound I ever heard or will hear. Sarah laughed and wept at the same time, and I stood there like a struck ox, and the baby cried, and it was the best sound in the world. By morning the crying had stopped, and by spring Sarah was gone too, of a fever that took her fast, like the country was collecting a debt. I don't tell you this for pity. I tell you so you'll understand what that sound up on the ridge was doing to me, night after night. Every man in that valley heard a coyote, or a trick, or the wind. I heard something else. I heard the one sound my life had taught me meant a living thing was fighting to stay in the world and losing. And I sat there, and I let it. Saturday, I couldn't anymore. I didn't decide it exactly. That's the part I've never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't there in my own skin. I didn't sit down and reason it out and choose the brave thing. I just woke up before light with the sound still in my ears. Even though the night had been quiet, it was in my ears. And I found myself pulling on my heavy coat and loading the old rifle and filling a satchel like a man watching himself from across the room. Bread, a blanket, the little flask of whiskey I kept for wounds, a coil of rope because I didn't know what I was walking into, and rope has never once made a situation worse. My gloves, Sarah's shawl, which I hadn't touched in 3 years, which I took down off its peg without letting myself think about why. The morning was iron gray and bitter. Frost had furred every blade of grass silver, and my breath hung in front of me and would not leave. I stood on my own porch a moment and looked up at the Blackwood pines, black against a sky the color of a healing bruise, and I was afraid. I want that on the record too. I wasn't brave. I was a frightened man who had finally gotten more frightened of doing nothing than of doing something. Del Prout found me at the edge of town, saddling up. "Calder," he said my name like a warning. "You're not." "I am. Harlan says." "Harlan says a lot." I cinched the strap harder than I needed to. "You want to come." He didn't. I watched him not want to, watched 3 or 4 different men wrestle behind his face, and the one that won was the one that always wins in a place like that, the one that wants to go home. It's a trick, Calder. Everybody knows it's a trick. Then I'll be the fool that proves it, and if I'm not back by dark, I stopped. There wasn't any good end to that sentence. If I'm not back by dark, don't come looking. No sense 2 fools in the trees. He stood in the road and watched me ride out. I know because I looked back once and he was still there, small and getting smaller, a man made out of the same fear I was riding away from. I didn't hate him for it. I'd been him, right up until that morning. I was only a day ahead of him, and I knew it. You don't ride up Blackwood. The timber's too thick, the ground too broken. I tied the horse off at the tree line where a game trail cut in, and I went the rest on foot, and within 100 yards the forest had swallowed the whole valley behind me like it had never been. I want to try to make you feel that place, because the place is half the story. The pines up there were old grandfathers of trees, so tall their tops were a rumor and their trunks wider than a barrel. The light came down through them in long, slow bars, green, gold, and cold, and it fell on a floor of 100 years of dead needles that gave underfoot without a sound. It was quiet in a way that had weight, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, that's full of something holding its breath. Somewhere water was running, thin and far. A jay screamed once and shut up like it regretted it. My own heart was the loudest thing on that mountain. I stopped every so often to listen. Nothing. And the nothing frightened me worse than the crying had, because 2 days ago the sound had come every night, and now, when I'd finally climbed up to answer it, the mountain had gone silent. And a silent thing that used to cry is a thing that has stopped being able to. I climbed. My bad knee complained. My breath sawed. I was 51 years old that winter and feeling every one of them, hauling myself up over deadfall and around boulders furred with frost, higher and higher into a stillness that pressed on my ears. And then near midday, I heard it. Not the crying, something worse and quieter, a sound I might have missed if I'd been one step further off, a small, exhausted, rhythmic little noise, barely more than a breath. Uh, uh, uh. The sound a thing makes when it's been crying so long the crying has worn all the way down to just the shape of itself, the machine still running with nothing left to run on. I went toward it the way you go toward a snake, everything in me wanting to go the other way. The trees opened into a little hollow, a cup in the mountain's shoulder where a great pine had come down years ago and torn a gap in the canopy. Down in that cup, in a nest of that old tree's roots, there was a bundle, a shape, a wrongness in the pattern of roots and shadow. And the shape was moving. I don't remember deciding to go down into the hollow. I remember I was already there, on my knees in the frozen needles, my hands out and shaking. And I remember the exact moment the shape resolved into what it was, because that moment is stitched into me and I'll carry it to my grave. It was a child. A little girl. 2 years old, maybe less, it's hard to tell with the small ones, and she was so thin. Black hair matted with pine pitch and dirt. A face gone gray-blue with cold. She was wrapped in a hide that had been good once, and someone had tucked her deep into the roots out of the wind, and someone had done it well, with love, with the last careful strength they had. Her eyes were half open, and when my shadow fell across her, those eyes moved, just found me, and out of her came that sound again, that worn-down little and one small hand, no bigger than a bird, opened and closed on the empty air. Reaching, still reaching. After days of it, after everyone in that whole valley had folded her cry into their suppers and their prayers and gone to sleep, she was still reaching for someone to come. And beside her, half under the roots, was her mother. I understood everything in that first second, the way you understand a thing all at once before your mind has caught up to let you. The way the woman lay. The way one arm was still curved around the space where the child had been, as if she'd fallen asleep holding her and the child had crawled out. The frost on her lashes. The stillness that isn't like the child's stillness, that isn't a thing running down, a stillness that's already all the way at the bottom. The mother had carried her child up onto that mountain and gotten hurt, or gotten sick, or simply run out of the country and the year and her own strength. And knowing she was dying, she had done the only thing left to a mother to do. She had spent her last warmth tucking her daughter into the roots of an old tree, out of the wind. And then she had lain down beside her and cried out into the dark, over and over, night after night, hopping, even here, even among us, even knowing what we were, that some living soul would hear a child crying and come. For 3 nights we heard her, and we called it a coyote, we called it a trick, we called it the wind. I put my hand against the little girl's cheek, and it was so cold I sobbed out loud, one ugly broken sound that the trees just swallowed the way they'd swallowed everything else. Her eyes were on mine. That small hand closed around one of my fingers with the very last of what she had. "I'm here," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "I'm here, I've got you now." And somewhere far behind me and below me, in a warm town in a green valley, 40 families were going about their day, none of them knowing that the crying had finally stopped, not because the trick was over, but because a man had finally come. I got my coat open, and I put that freezing child against my bare chest, and I wrapped Sarah's shawl around us both, and I knelt there in the roots beside a dead woman I would never know the name of, and I held her daughter's cold, small body against the only heat I had, and I begged something I'd stopped believing in for 3 years. I'll give you that now, up front, because I spent the walk down the mountain not knowing, and I wouldn't wish that not knowing on you across 4,000 words. She didn't die, but there were hours in there I was sure she would, and I want to take you through them, because a thing you nearly lose changes you different than a thing you keep easy. Getting off that mountain with a dying child and no free hands is its own kind of nightmare, and I'll spare you most of it. I made a sling out of Sarah's shawl and the blanket, bound the little girl to my chest so I could feel every breath she took, and count them, God, I counted them, each one a small mercy handed to me one at a time. I left the mother. I want to be honest about that too, because it's one of the heavy things. I left her. I couldn't carry them both, and the child was the one still breathing, and so I made the arithmetic no man should have to make, and I left a woman lying in the roots of a tree because her daughter needed my arms more than she needed a burial. I marked the place in my mind. I told myself I'd come back. I said something over her that wasn't a prayer I knew, just words, just I'm sorry we were what we were. I'm sorry it was us that finally came. And then I turned my back on her and started down. And that turning is a thing I still feel in the muscles of my back on cold nights. The child breathed against me. That was the rope I climbed down by. She breathed and I counted and I went. It was full dark by the time I got the horse, and past midnight before I saw the lamps of town. I hadn't stopped except to trickle whiskey-warmed water between her lips and put my mouth against the top of her head to feel for the heat of her, that small furnace of a living child that I'd forgotten, that I'd spent 3 years unlearning. She'd stirred once on the trail, turned her face into my chest and made a sound, and I have to tell you, hardened old man that I was, I wept like a boy at that sound, because that sound was life deciding to stay a while longer. I didn't take her to the church. That's the thing people always ask after. Why not the church? Why not the doctors? Why not somewhere warm and full of help? Because I knew my town, that's why. I knew that if I rode into the middle of that valley in the dead of night hollering for help and a woman came to the door and saw what color that child was, saw the black hair and the hide wrapping, and the little face that wasn't one of ours, I knew that some of the help would curdle into something else. Not all of it. There were good souls in that town, more than Harlan Voss would have had you believe. But I couldn't gamble the child's life on my neighbors being their best selves at 1 in the morning, with an old fear rubbed raw by 3 nights of crying they'd told themselves was a trick. So I took her home, to my own cold house, and I built the fire up till it roared, and I filled every pot with water and set it to warm, and I did the only doctoring I knew, which was the doctoring you do for a lamb born blue in a January storm. Warm but slow, never sudden, skin against skin. I sat in front of that fire the rest of the night with a stranger's child held against my heart, dribbling warm sugar water into her, whispering nonsense, and somewhere in the gray hour before dawn, she opened her eyes all the way, really opened them, and looked at me. And she was afraid. Of course she was afraid. I was the wrong face, the wrong smell, the wrong everything. She'd woken warm in the arms of a big pale stranger in a strange house, and her mother was gone. And she did the bravest thing I ever saw a soul do. She looked that terror in the eye and she didn't scream. She just looked at me, and her lips shook, and 2 tears ran down over the color coming back into her cheeks, and she held so still. "It's all right," I said. I didn't have any of her words. I didn't know a single one. So I said it soft over and over the way you gentle a spooked colt, not the meaning, just the music of it. "It's all right. It's all right. Old Calder's got you. It's all right." She didn't understand a word, but something in the music of it reached her, because after a long while she stopped holding herself so rigid, and her small hand found the front of my shirt and closed on it and held. I named her Wren in my own head that morning, for the smallness of her and the size of the sound she'd made. I knew it wasn't her name. I knew she had a name, a real one, given to her by that woman in the roots in a language I'd been taught to fear. But I had to call her something, and Wren is what came, and I've never stopped thinking of her by it even now. She got strong fast, the way the young do, like life is just waiting to come flooding back if you'll give it half a door. By the third day she was eating mush and watching me across the room with those big, careful eyes, tracking me everywhere, and by the fourth she'd cry if I left the house, which about took the legs out from under me every time. On the fifth day she laughed. I dropped a spoon, that's all. I dropped a spoon and made a face at it, and this child who'd lost the entire world laughed, a startled little peal of it there and gone, her own laugh surprising her. I had to go stand out on the porch in the cold a minute after that. A man needs a minute sometimes. But I want you to understand this wasn't a story about a lonely widower who found a child and everything was mended. That's not what it was. Every hour of that sweetness sat right beside a cold, hard fact, and the fact was this. I was hiding an Apache child in my house, in a valley that would not understand, and I could not hide her forever. Somebody was going to see the smoke and the small tracks in the yard. Somebody was going to ask why old Calder was buying goat's milk. And somewhere out beyond the Blackwood pines, in the country we didn't ride into, there were people this child belonged to, a father maybe, grandparents. A band that had lost a woman and a little girl and did not know if they were living or dead. People who were, right then, grieving her, or looking for her, or both. Which meant sooner or later I was going to have to make the second hard decision. And I already knew, the way you know a storm's coming by the ache in an old brake, that it was going to cost me worse than the first. It came sooner than I was ready for. These things always do. It was the 9th day. I'd gone out to the barn to see to the horse and left Wren asleep by the fire, and when I came back across the yard I stopped dead, because there were tracks in the fresh snow that weren't mine. Moccasin tracks, 2 sets, leading up to my window and away again. They'd been here. While I was in the barn, no, before that, in the night maybe, someone had come down out of the pines, right up to my house and looked in my window at the sleeping child and gone again without a sound, without taking her, without a word. I stood in that yard with my heart going like a hammer, and I turned in a slow circle looking at the tree line, and I couldn't see a soul, but I could feel them. You know how you can feel a thing watching you? The whole mountain was watching me, and I understood standing there that they'd found her, that they'd known where she was maybe for days, that they could have come in the night and taken her back and left me none the wiser, could have done worse than that to the man who had their child, and instead they had come and looked and waited. They were watching to see what I'd do. They were deciding up in those trees what kind of man I was. And I realized, with a cold that had nothing to do with the snow, that they'd been deciding since the mountain. That maybe the whole time I'd been climbing up toward that crying, sure I was alone, I hadn't been alone at all. That maybe the reason no harm had come to a lone pale man blundering up into their country was that they'd been letting him, watching to see if, this time, one of us would finally come. I went back inside. My hands weren't steady. Wren was awake, sitting up by the fire, and when she saw me her whole face opened up like a flower and she reached both arms toward me, and I crossed that room and picked her up and held her too tight, and over her shoulder I looked at the black window and the dark trees beyond it. "I know you're out there," I said low. "I know." The fire popped. The child's heart beat against mine. And outside, the mountain kept its silence and waited and watched, and did not yet tell me what it had decided about the likes of me. I'd known they would. Ever since the tracks in the snow, I'd lived every hour braced for it, and a thing you brace for still knocks you flat when it finally comes. The town had started to know by then, too. That's the part that ran alongside everything else in those last days like a second river. Delprude had ridden out to see was I all right, and I'd stood in my own doorway and lied to a man's face while a child's cough carried faint from inside, and I'd watched him hear it and watched him decide for that day not to have heard it. Good men do that sometimes. They give you a day. But word moves in a valley the way water moves downhill, and by that Sunday there were looks in town I didn't like, and Harlan Voss had a new theory, and this one had my name in it. So I was caught between two peoples, the way you get caught in a river between two currents, and I want to tell you honest that I had begun, God forgive me, to hope, to make plans, to think maybe I could keep her. Move on maybe out of the valley, take Ren somewhere new where nobody knew what she was or what I was, and raise her, and not be an old man alone anymore. I let myself want it. I want you to know I let myself want it all the way because that's what made the rest so hard. They came in the gray light before a snow. I stepped out to fetch wood and they were simply there, 3 of them at the edge of my yard where a minute before there'd been nothing. They'd let me see them. That was the mercy in it, and I understood it as mercy even then. They'd come openly so I wouldn't be afraid or so I'd have the chance to be brave. 2 men, and a step ahead of them a woman, older, straight-backed, with a face carved by more grief than one face ought to hold. She had Ren's eyes. I knew before anything else was said. She had the child's exact eyes. The grandmother, come for what was hers. We stood a long time in that yard, the snow starting to sift down between us, none of us with a single shared word. And then the old woman said something low, steady, and one of the men translated in broken trader's English, careful as a man crossing ice. You, he said, you go up, you bring her down. A pause. Why? Why, of all the questions? Why did you go up the mountain when your whole town said don't? Why did you, of all people, one of them, come when we cried? I didn't have the words to answer it right. I'm not sure there are words, so I did the only thing I could. I turned and went inside, and I came back out with Ren wrapped in Sarah's shawl, warm and fat-cheeked and alive, so alive, and I carried her across that yard through the falling snow, and I put her into her grandmother's arms. That was the second hard decision, and it wasn't a decision at all in the end, which is how you know it was the right one. There was never really any choosing. There was only how long I let myself pretend there was. The child fussed at first, reached back for me, cried out, that same reaching hand, and it near killed me. But then the old woman spoke to her, murmured her real name, her true name, the one I never knew, and the child went still, went home in her skin, turned her face into her grandmother's neck the way she'd turned it into my chest that first night, and I understood I was watching her leave me even as I stood there, and that this was exactly, precisely what I had climbed a mountain to make possible. The old woman looked at me over the child's black hair for a long moment. Then she reached up. I flinched. God help me. I flinched. A lifetime of taught fear moving my body before my heart could stop it, and she pressed something into my hand and closed my cold fingers around it. It was small, beaded, a little thing a mother had made, the kind of thing you make for a child, worn smooth. It had been the dead woman's, I think, or the child's, something from up on that mountain. Something that had been meant to keep a small one safe, given now to the man who'd finished the job it started. I never learned what it meant to give it, whether it was thanks, or a bond, or just a grieving grandmother's way of saying you were part of this now, whether either of us wanted it or not. I've turned it over 10,000 times since, in every sense of the word, and I've never been sure. Some things you're not meant to be sure of. Some things you just carry. They turned to go. The child lifted her head once and found me over her grandmother's shoulder and looked at me, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know what was in that look. I've made it mean 100 things on 100 lonely nights. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was already forgetting me, the way the very young forget, mercifully. Maybe by summer I'd be less to her than a dream. But she lifted her hand, that small hand, and whether it was a wave or a reach or just a child's hand moving in the cold, I raised mine back. And then the snow came down heavier, and the trees took them, the way those trees took everything, and they were gone. Up into the country we didn't ride into. back to the people I'd been taught my whole life to fear. I stood in my empty yard until the snow had filled in their tracks and my own, until there was nothing left to show that anyone had stood there at all, until my hands went past cold to numb around the little beaded thing. I went back up the mountain that spring when the snow let go. I found the hollow and the old down pine, and what the winter and the country had left of the woman in the roots. I buried her proper as one man with a folding spade can manage, and I said words over her again, better ones this time, though still not any prayer I knew. I told her I'd found her girl in time. I told her the girl had laughed once at a dropped spoon, and that she was home now with her grandmother, with her people, with her true name. I thought she'd want to know the true name found its way back. I told her I was sorry it had taken us 3 nights. I told her that I heard her at the end, that somebody heard. The town never did come all the way around to me. Some did. Del Prout would meet my eye after, which he hadn't always before, and there were a few others who'd stop me in the road and not quite ask, and I'd not quite answer, and something would pass between us anyway. But Harlan Voss went to his grave telling folks I'd been bewitched, and there were houses in that valley where my name went sour and I let it. A man learns what a thing is worth by what it costs him, and I'd have paid it twice. I never saw Wren again. I want to be honest about that because I know how these stories are supposed to go, and this one doesn't go there. She didn't come back grown, years later, to find the old man who saved her. There was no reunion. That's not how the country worked, and it's not how the fear worked on either side. She grew up out there beyond the pines, in a life I couldn't picture, among people I never knew, and I grew old in here. And the mountain kept its distance between us the way it always had. But some nights, when the wind comes down off Blackwood a certain way, and I hear it moving through the dead timber up on the ridge, I still stop whatever I'm doing. I still listen. Old fool that I am, I still half expect to hear it, that thin, high, breaking sound, want caught in the middle of it, a living thing calling out into the dark for somebody, anybody to come. And I think about how close we all came to letting it just be the wind. I keep the little beaded thing in the logbook, right at the front, so it's the first thing I touch every morning before I write down the weather. I never did write down what really made that crying in the forest. Some things you don't set down, some things you just